Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a deep dive into the issue of transfer of training in sports. What exactly is transfer of training? How should it be assessed? And what have we learned about the best ways to achieve it? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to cover yet another topic related to a book chapter I'm currently working on. Back in episode 10, I introduced the concept of transfer of training, and since then have covered a smattering of articles and had a few interviews related to it in the podcast. Today I want to take a deeper dive into this very important issue. First off, what exactly do we mean by the term transfer of training? Well, there are actually several different types. In general, transfer of training can be defined as the gain or loss in the capability to perform one task, called the criterion task, as a result of practice on some other task, called the transfer task. So note, transfer has a direction, positive, we could get better after training, or negative, we could get worse. And it has a magnitude. That is, we could get a lot worse or a lot better. Or there could be only a slight change in performance. Let me use some examples to highlight some of the different types of transfer we can have and how it can be assessed. Imagine that our transfer task, that is, what the athlete is going to be doing during practice, involves using a smartphone app designed to improve pitch recognition in baseball. So, the player watches an animation of a pitch and is then required to indicate as quickly as possible whether it's a fastball, curveball, or changeup by swiping in a particular direction on their phone. To evaluate the effectiveness of this training app, we measure pitch recognition in the app, so how many they identified correctly, before and after 6 weeks of training with the app. This is an example of what is called near transfer, because the criterion task is very near to, and in this example is exactly the same as, the transfer task. Another example of near transfer in this case would be if the criterion task involved using the app to test the player's ability to recognize types of pitches that were not used in training. For example, a slider and a knuckleball. Or after training, they had to use a different response, say calling out the pitch type instead of swiping on the app. Near transfer is almost always positive and very large in magnitude. When the criterion task is very similar to the transfer task, we almost always show a lot of improvement on the criterion. So, first key point of the day. A demonstration of near transfer on its own is completely meaningless. Think about it. As human beings, we can get better at almost anything when we practice it enough. So, unless the goal of training is to prepare you for a pitch recognition app tournament, demonstrating near transfer in my example tells us nothing. More specifically, it tells us nothing about whether training with the app transfers to performance on the field, which is of course what we care about. This meaninglessness of near transfer is a large component of the FTC charges laid against the brain training app Lumosity, which I discussed back in episode 22E. Let's look at a couple more examples. Imagine the same pitch recognition app training is the transfer task, but now we use a criterion task in which the players face live pitching, and they were instructed to only swing when a particular type of pitch was thrown, say a fastball. If training with the app resulted in the batter improving on the swing test, that would be an example of what I would call moderate distance transfer, because there is some separation between the transfer and criterion tasks in this case. A demonstration of positive transfer in this case is more meaningful because the criterion task is a bit closer to the thing we care about, actually getting a hit in a real baseball game. However, it's still not all the way there, so we can't be 100% sure that training in the app improves in-game performance. To test for that, we need to measure far transfer. A test of far transfer involves using a criterion task that is essentially the goal of the training in the first place. So in my pitch recognition app example, if training with the app results in higher batting average, on-base percentage, more walks, etc. during the season, that would be a demonstration of positive FAR transfer. The findings from motor learning research, which I will discuss in detail in a second, suggest that unless the transfer and criterion tasks are highly similar, there will be essentially no FAR transfer effects. One of the limitations of transfer research is that most people only talk about near or far transfer. As hinted at by my example, I think it would be beneficial to have a bit more resolution on the transfer scale.
Stop that train, I'm leaving. Stop that train, I'm leaving, I won't be long.
A couple other words of caution in terms of interpreting transfer effects. First, it's critical to ask as compared to who when looking at studies. So imagine that training on the pitch recognition app during a baseball off-season results in batters having a higher on-base percentage in the next season than they did the season before. Compared to who? The league average? Batters that did no training in the off-season? Batters that did some different type of training? If our pitch recognition app training is not directly compared to some other type of training group, then we have no way of knowing whether the effect is just a placebo effect. When athletes believe that the training they're doing will work, it increases motivation, confidence, and self-efficacy, which will make them improve even if the app does nothing in terms of the underlying perceptual cognitive processes the advertising claims it is targeting. As an example, I've linked to a study in the show notes which involved the use of a placebo-racket effect in tennis. Essentially, a group of tennis players were told that their racket was going to be custom modified based on their body measurements. In reality, the researchers just took the racket away from them, did nothing to it, then handed it back a couple weeks later. The players in this group all showed significant improvements in play relative to a control group that did no training. If you're an athlete, coach, or manager in sports and are willing to accept a placebo effect, then I guess that's up to you. It is improvement after all. I hear many claim it's better than nothing or it couldn't hurt. But I would say two things. First, I think you should be demanding more from training methods and technologies. We have the knowledge to design things that affect real changes. But if everyone is willing to accept placebos, there's not much reason for designers to put in the effort required to achieve that. Second, if all you want is a placebo, don't spend a lot of money on it. There are a lot of ways to produce them essentially for free. Another caution I would make is with regards to correlational studies. Imagine if we took a group of existing Major League Baseball players, gave them the pitch recognition app test, then found that their score on the test was significantly and positively correlated with their batting average during the season. While this is a good result that is suggestive that training with the app might be useful, it is not nearly as strong as transfer of training evidence. All these correlational results are showing is that the two tasks share some common elements, not that improving one will make you better at the other. So for example, it could be the case that players with a higher batting average are more vigilant and can keep their attentional focus on the task more. This in turn would make them better at the pitch recognition test. Anecdotally, I've seen this a lot in my own research. More skilled athletes tend to be more competitive and try harder when you bring them into the lab, so they do better on all the tests whether they're really relevant to their sport or not. Another thing we should always consider is the face validity of the training, especially if there's only one study showing evidence of transfer. Imagine if we showed that pitchers who trained with our pitch recognition app threw more strikeouts in the following season. On the surface, there is no rationale for why learning to visually distinguish a fastball from a curveball would help you throw these any better. So this relationship has very low face validity. This raises the strong possibility that the result may be spurious and purely due to random chance. If the effect is replicated in different studies, then we might take it more seriously and start digging into it. One final point before I leave this pitch recognition app example. If our criterion tasks involve hitting against a real pitcher in a game, this type of training is also an example of part to whole transfer. That is, our transfer task is essentially taking one part of the skill, in this case pitch recognition, and training it in isolation, while our criterion task is the whole skill, which involves other parts too, for example, actually swinging the bat. I talked about part versus whole training back in episode 35. In general, we can get good part to whole transfer of training when the task involves a series of discrete steps with very little overlap that can be easily broken apart. So for example, it's been argued that pitch recognition can be partialed out and trained separately from swinging because the recognition part is essentially completely done before the batter starts their swing. For tasks that are more continuous and without discrete steps, there is unlikely to be good part-to-whole transfer of training. Finally, two other types of transfer of training I will mention briefly do not attempt to look at transfer from one task to a different task, but instead look at transfer between the same task performed two different ways. Classic examples of this include bimanual or interlimb transfer, where, for example, the task is learned with the right hand, then tested with the left hand, and interocular transfer, which involves the analogous procedure but switching from one eye to the other. In general, these types of transfer are positive and large in magnitude. I will return to this point shortly.
These excuses, well, they've got to seem quite lame, but I'm telling you, it's not my fault, please darling, blame the train.
So, what has research taught us about the best ways to achieve high-magnitude positive transfer of training? For a good review of early research in this area, I would highly recommend the technical report written by Schmidt and Young in 1986. Link in the show notes. There are some key findings to come out of this work, but instead of telling you about a bunch of older studies, I'm going to talk about a brand new one that essentially found the same things. In a study published in Experimental Brain Research earlier this year, Sarian and colleagues examined the transfer of training from learning to balance on one foot on a slackline. 13 participants completed 6 weeks of training, in which they were given the goal of standing on the preferred leg for as long as possible. They were given no instructions about how to achieve this. Before and after training, they performed two tests: balance on one foot as long as possible on the slackline, and do the same thing on a balance beam, what is sometimes called the flamingo test. What was found? Even though the transfer and criterion tasks are highly similar, there was relatively little transfer between slackline training and the flamingo test. The amount of time participants could stand in the flamingo test increased from pre to post training by only about 2 seconds. Meanwhile, performance on the slackline test improved by nearly 12 seconds from pre to post. And this is the sad story we get from most transfer training research. Unless the transfer and criterion tasks are nearly identical, the magnitude of transfer is very, very small. Typically, transfer effects are expressed as a percentage. That is, what is the percentage difference in performance on the criterion task for a group that completed the transfer task as compared to one that did not? Across a wide range of simple laboratory tasks, for example, tracking a moving object with a hand movement, and highly similar criterion tasks, for example, trying to track the same object but at a different speed, Schmidt found an average magnitude of transfer of only about 30%. As soon as the transfer and criterion tasks began to diverge, for example, tracking an object with a foot movement instead of a hand movement, percentage transfer fell basically to zero. These findings fit well with a theory first proposed by Thorndike and Woodworth in 1901 called the identical elements theory. They proposed that, quote, spread of practice occurs only when identical elements are concerned in the influencing and influenced function. Transfer of training is not based on general faculties, but is particular and limited, determined by the identity of the stimuli and/or responses made to them in the two situations. Although the theory of identical elements is consistent with most of the research findings, it is pretty limited because it doesn't tell us what elements need to be shared between the transfer and criterion tasks, other than all of them. I will get back to this point shortly. But before ending this section, I wanted to mention another interesting aspect of the balance study by Sarian and colleagues. To determine how exactly participants learned the slackline task, body kinematics were recorded with the Viacon system and analyzed using a neural network technique called self-organizing maps, or SOM. The SOM technique allowed the researchers to identify balance and coordination patterns that were qualitatively different from each other. The analysis revealed that the participants in their experiment improved on the slackline by adopting a strategy consisting of a higher range of motion with movements that were lower velocity. It seems as if participants switched from a purely reflex-guided balance strategy, which is used for normal balance but cannot handle the large fluctuations on the slackline, to a more centrally controlled top-down strategy. The authors argue that this explains why there was so little transfer to the flamingo test. The newly acquired balance strategy was dependent on the expectation of an unstable moving surface and would not be useful for a task on a stable surface. So, second key point of the day, whether or not there will be high transfer of training depends much more on the task demands and the perceptual information involved, as opposed to the specific limbs or muscle groups used. Even though the slackline and flamingo tests used exactly the same muscle groups in this study, there was no transfer because the task demands were very different. Conversely, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there's typically good transfer from switching to the right leg to the left leg, so completely different muscles, when the task demands are held the same. What about negative transfer of training? How worried should we be that our transfer task may actually make performers worse at the criterion task? Well, luckily, negative transfer of training is almost as difficult to produce as positive transfer of training. Schmidt and Young cite long-term retention of motor skills, for example, never forgetting how to ride a bike, as probably the best evidence of this. Think about all the different perceptual motor tasks you've performed since the last time you rode a bike. If there were truly strong negative transfer effects, surely one of these tasks would be similar enough to biking to cause negative transfer. In reality, to get strong negative transfer of training, you essentially have to do a 180-degree remapping of the task and keep everything else almost identical. A good example is learning to ride a backwards bicycle, which I discussed back in episode 63. I've included the link to the fun video showing this again in the show notes. Check it out if you haven't yet. So, unless you completely flip the controls around, you are unlikely to get true negative transfer. That is, making someone worse on a criterion task as compared to someone that did no training at all. However, there are a couple other negative transfer type effects that are much easier to produce. The first is something I talked about back in episode 53 when talking about direct learning. That is, becoming perceptually attuned to non-specifying variables. Without going into all the details again, if you overly restrict the range of conditions a performer faces in practice, they are likely to learn a strategy that won't work anymore when you expand to more game-like conditions. So it is possible to produce a negative transfer effect in comparison to another performer that learned the skill under more variable conditions. Another type of negative effect that sort of falls into this category is interference with consolidation processes in perceptual motor learning. This is a bit different than a pure transfer effect because it essentially involves two different types of practice done close together. As an example, imagine you're trying to teach someone to hit a baseball. You have them face a live pitcher during the first part of practice. This should lead to positive transfer training to the criterion of actually playing in a baseball game because it's highly similar. But imagine right after they face the baseball pitcher in practice, you have them try cricket batting. As I discussed back in episode 19, having a performer practice a task that has some similarities, but different task dynamics immediately after baseball batting is highly likely to interfere with the consolidation process and make them acquire the skill of baseball batting less effectively. Note, this isn't to say that having them trying their hand at cricket batting in a completely different practice session would be bad. In fact, variability of practice research suggests it might actually be beneficial. It's just spacing different practice tasks too close together can lead to reduced transfer of training. Okay, so where do we go from here with regards to transfer of training? Well, I'll quote from the Schmidt and Young article I mentioned earlier. Quote, "Part of the problem is that systematic work on the fundamental basis of motor transfer, in which hypotheses about the similarity and differences among tasks which do and do not transfer to each other, have simply not been done." Sadly, that statement is as true now as it was in 1986, especially when we consider complex movement tasks like those involved in most sports. But to move forward, I think maybe we should be thinking about transfer in a completely different way. Building on some of Richard Schmidt's ideas, I think we should start considering learning and transfer to really be part of the same thing. That is, acquiring a skill essentially involves transfer of training from one point in the learning process to the next. Whether you take a non-linear pedagogy view that these points are attractors in the perceptual motor landscape, or take a more traditional view like that of Fitz and Posner, that we pass through distinct cognitive stages during skill acquisition, the goal of practice should be to achieve high positive transfer of training to the next point along the pathway of being elite. If this is true, then even when there is poor transfer of training between a particular type of practice and the final criterion task, the practice could still be useful if it has high transfer of training to the next point on the pathway. That is, it might not get you all the way there, but it might get you one step closer. So I think we need a new agenda for transfer of training research. Specifically, we need to define the next point on the path to being elite for the performers we're studying. Whether it's some core competency, being able to handle a particular set of conditions, etc. And then use this as the criterion for evaluating transfer training, rather than making the leap to the final product. Coming on a near future episode of the podcast, I'm going to talk about the approach I've been using to try and encourage this type of point-to-point transfer, adaptive training. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
They said Jesus came, gone through St. Louis.